Okay, great. Let's start the panel. I know we're running late, but we'll still end at 5, so that gives us a good 40 minutes. And none of us know the answers anyway, so let's see. Is the microphone on?
Test.
Test. Okay, great. Yeah, so welcome to the panel. I'm super excited to have such an incredible set of speakers and kind of thoughtful people here. So we're just going to fly by the seat of our pants on this one. I prepared like one question, and then we'll go from there. So to me, like, one of the fundamental conundrums of our time is, what does it mean to understand, right? And this comes in many different disciplines. So we're all very interested in, do LLMs really understand language? But what do we mean by that? What's the best evidence for that? What's the best evidence against it? What are the differences? Also, we would like to understand how LLMs work. What does that mean? And so forth. So, and then we can go from there. So maybe we can go through each of the speakers, and but let's do the questions separately. So what does it mean for an LLM to understand language? What's your best evidence for any aspect of language that it understands? And what's your strongest evidence against the hypothesis that it understands some form of language? So let's go for it. You had a very insightful talk on that. No. Feel free to repeat your talk.
Yeah. Well, I talked mostly, I guess, about like generating language maybe is the perspective I was under. But I think I would say similar things about understanding language. I don't think that it's easy to evaluate. I think the process of language understanding, though, is recovering the intent that another person is trying to like convey through their language production. But that's super broad, and like there's definitely ways that like even if I can't evaluate whether a human I'm talking to is understanding what I'm saying. So it's like,
yeah,
I don't know if there's like a global way of understanding language.
Well, I'm curious from your talk, it did seem like several of your points kind of conveyed that at least got what the common ground was. Like the LM could participate even if it couldn't change it.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that in like a more restricted sense, like understanding, you know, can include probing at what the model thinks is in the common ground now after you've, you know, said something new. And certainly there's actually a lot of, I think there's some work that is actually explicitly looking at this. So actually also on the Minecraft dialogue corpus, I think is looking at like whether models have like, you know, updated their representation of the common ground or something like that. But yeah, I think it's hard, but I think it's just really hard to like figure out what's in the common ground and what the model thinks is in the common ground.
But do we have any evidence that it doesn't, or like is failing to like respond to surprisal of a user?
Well, I think it's hard to I think that what I said before about like text-based information seeking interactions, I think it's largely doing a pretty good job. But I think when it comes to understanding, models are that's a much easier, actually I think it's, there's this tension between like what we expect the models to do and like what are the kinds of utterances that we're giving them to test. And so like in these information seeking dialogues, like it's, you know, we can say that they achieve some kind of understanding or whatever, but like understanding like general language in all possible contexts, I think is probably impossible to test, but it's something that we can reasonably assume that other people are able to do. If that makes sense. I don't know, probably.
Let's keep going. So yeah, again, the question is, what's your strongest evidence, or what does it mean for an LLM to understand language? What's the strongest evidence for and against that proposition?
I guess I think I'd be tempted to kind of go back to some of the intentional stance kind of stuff that I mentioned in my talk for thinking about linguistic structure and say like, well, is it useful in understanding the model or making some prediction about its behavior or interacting with it to say it understands or it doesn't understand. And it seems to me like there are plenty of useful cases, right? If we think of like understanding as a kind of human concept that we've developed, and we have some intuitions about like what is it to understand, what is it to not understand. It seems like there are cases where we could usefully apply that to models, right? And say, okay, if the model understands, it's going to, in the next, few things it generates, it's like, something about common ground. It's going to do this and this and this. And I think some reasonable amount of time models do that. Like people are able to have, long dialogues with them now. And it seems like that requires some kind of understanding like this. And at the same time, we can also say like, oh, it didn't understand. Like it thought, I thought this, I clearly made it information available about what's in the common ground, but it didn't understand that. And so the fact that we can use those concepts, if we're willing to take the stance that what these concepts are is their ability to be useful to us, I do think that these concepts are useful. And so, yeah, a kind of gradient point for understanding, maybe.
Interesting. Okay. Laura, feel free to extend it to like, what does it mean for the humans to even understand language or so forth?
Yeah, I think that the same question does hold true in the human case, particularly for like trying to model understanding in the human brain. I think that the same, like you can have a very strong analogy to just understanding that in LLMs too. And in the human case, I think that we assess understanding based on how that person reacts to us in their behavior. And I think that that is also how we essentially evaluate understanding in large language models. Like, do I give it a prompt and it replies in a way that suggests that it understood what I said? And the same is true when I talked to my postdoc Jill. We're talking about our project. I don't know, like when I'm engaging with anybody, I gauge their understanding based on the information they provide back, given the information I provided to them.
Yeah. There's a notion in physics of deep versus shallow understanding, and the physicists that I and others admire are the ones who can make these deep logical leaps that go far beyond what's known at the time, right? Like Einstein equating the curvature of space and time to the falling of an apple, right? Like, and there are papers like, for example, by Ye-Jin Choi on how earlier models were not really doing reasoning. They were taking shortcuts. And so they can fool us into thinking their understanding by giving the right answer, yet their internal computational steps don't match the correct reasoning process. So how do we prevent ourselves from fooling ourselves into thinking that LLMs are understanding more than we think they are?
Maybe I'll just like quickly plug something. So we have a paper last year looking at sensitivity of models to like prompt formatting changes, looking at like these really, really subtle changes that like this is an assumption, but the assumption would be that they're so subtle that humans would not change their behavior at all. And we have this like sort of Bayesian inference process to efficiently determine what the sort of sensitivity is for a particular model and task. And so I think, one question is, is understanding a property of like a particular utterance? Is it a property of like a set of utterances that mean the same thing or should mean the same thing? Does it have more to do with like I used this word earlier, like legibility, like the ability for us to build a coherent model of the language model, which I think maybe ties into your next question about like interpretability or understanding of like what a model is actually doing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but that was just one.
Great. Sasha, from the CS perspective, what's your take on the first question?
Yeah, so I think I'm particularly interested in, I think, what Alane was calling like the tech-seeking world. And in that sense, I feel like they've demonstrated enough linguistic competency that I can call them understanding, just from a casual point of view. One thing I've struggled with is this kind of Pareto frontier idea that like humans can do faster reasoning but have way less retrieval, and language models have like less reasoning but way more retrieval. And things like what you're describing and this kind of deep understanding, to me, is some weird combination of those two, where it's like sometimes things that look like reasoning are really just retrieval or memorization or just knowledge. And so I guess we were talking about this earlier about kind of like whether they'll have this kind of like anthropomorphic structure to them or not, like something like understanding is going on that is different than maybe I would be able to kind of analogize it to.
Great. And Brenden, I think you have a lot to say about this, given your work on like lack of systematic generalization, or now do you feel like they can systematically generalize in the ways that you wanted them to before, or what's the connection between systematic generalization and understanding, if any?
Yeah. So I'll introduce myself since I'm speaking tomorrow. I'm Brenden Lake. I'm a professor of psychology and data science at NYU. And I think systematicity definitely ties into what is a very important aspect of understanding as we know it as humans. I think the first part of your question was the strongest evidence, what others have said, like Laura and Sasha, just talking to the systems and seeing their responses and feeling like it in many cases is an adequate response to what you were asking, right? Is regardless of what sort of theory of understanding you ascribe to, there's a certain feeling to that which is powerful.
So it's vibes.
Yeah, but that's not all there is, for sure. So I wrote a paper with my NYU colleague Greg Murphy on word meaning in minds and machines, where we didn't try to figure out understanding in the most general sense, but just the understanding of a particular word, right? What would be the necessary qualities of understanding? Not in general. There's no one field has a monopoly on what it means, what understanding is, but from sort of a psychological perspective, right? And we had 5 desiderata. I'm not sure I'll be able to remember them all, but one of which there has to be genuine connection between the word and like things in the world. That's crucial for human understanding, right? You have to be able to use words in order to express your goal and intentions and beliefs. You have to be able to say, please pass me the butter knife if you're intending to spread some butter on your bread, or be able to act on somebody else's words and say, if they say, please pass me the butter knife, you know what that means, what actions you'd have to do. Systematicity was one of them, compositionality, that are psychological semantics has this property where we can, add in a new word, a new concept that we learned, and immediately be able to combine it with the other words that we have. That's part of our understanding. And also be able to use words to update our beliefs. Like if you tell a child, oh, dolphin may look like a fish, but it's not, right? Can be a pretty crisp update. And that type of crispness, I don't think we see very in the same way in LLMs, except for in context learning, perhaps, right? But then that'll go away. Right. So I think the technology has been sort of creeping along all those dimensions. I think a number of them you might say are satisfied now. Especially, it's tough to write a paper like that in psychology, given the sort of pacing of the publication is so different. This was in Psychological Review, which is a very long, very slow journal. And we wrote the paper using examples from GPT-2. And by the time it was published, it actually appeared in print. GPT-4 came out a few weeks later. So, but nevertheless, I'd stand by those desiderata. I think they're critical to meaning as, when someone else uses a word, how we think they understand it.
Cool. Very interesting. And then the linguistics perspective, Steve, it'd be great to.
I'm not that insightful, and I don't know. I don't think I have a great answer. I'd probably vote with Kyle here. But one thing that always occurs to me for questions like this is this kind of old AI quote about whether a submarine swims or not, right? And the lesson there, right, is that there's not really a fact of the matter about whether a submarine swims, right? There's some semantic convention that we pick about whether we're going to attribute swimming to them or not. And that's how I feel about most of these kinds of questions. It's like there's no ground truth because there's not really a precise meaning for understanding. Like we all have some intuition about maybe some of the things it should capture, but those intuitions are not really precise enough to be decided in any situation. And so it's mostly meaningless debate. No offense.
Interesting. And no, that's interesting that understanding itself is meaningless. I mean, yeah, it's.
I don't know. But we could go back down the line and see what people think about submarine swimming.
We can take a question, then we can come back to if it's on this topic. Yeah.
Well, if I say my wife doesn't understand me, it doesn't mean that she's speaking a different language, right?
But there's no new information in that statement.
No, but it's this concept of theory of mind and the ability to at least think. I can feel what the other person feels.
Yeah.
And if we attribute that to a language model, I mean, people are using language models already as artificial partners and think they understand them in that way. And I think we have to make a distinction there. If we take that, if we use that, too gratuitously, it's a danger.
Yeah.
I think that the simplest situation is where the person responds to you in the way that you would have responded to that same thing. And that's the, I think, simplest case when you can say, yeah, they understood because they said what I would have said. But I think that kind of gets to the point, like, I don't know, there's someone that's just like way smarter than you, and actually they deeply understand that thing more than you understand it, and they say something that you never would have said, and maybe from that you would conclude, oh, they don't understand. But actually it's they understood something different, and what they understood actually might be closer to the ground truth. So then you end up with this kind of like, I don't know, like, yeah. And then, because I was thinking, oh, we could figure out what a large language model understands by just getting like a distribution of answers from humans. But just because the model doesn't say something in distribution of what the human says doesn't mean they don't understand. Maybe they're the Einstein in the situation.
Yeah, I mean, one anecdote that I've seen a lot is, people have some rare disease and they go to specialist after specialist after specialist, and none of them can diagnose the rare disease, but they ask GPT-4 or whatnot, and they give a correct diagnosis of the rare disease because they can look laterally across their medical records and so forth, and they have the entire knowledge of the internet. So that's I would characterize that as a level of understanding that humans can't achieve. But again, would we call it information retrieval? Okay, so then let's talk about the flip side of things. Like, we would all love to understand how LLMs work, how they learn, what they learn, how they behave, why they have the failure modes they do, why they have the superhuman capabilities they do. What would it take to get there? What's some of the most exciting research you've seen? What would you like to see done? Or maybe to phrase it in a, like, there's a famous quote by Horace Lamb, if I died and went to heaven, I would like to be enlightened about two things: quantum electrodynamics and turbulence. And of the former, of the former, I have some hope. Right? So this is a joke about why turbulence is so hard to understand, and we still don't understand it. So let me ask, like, quote unquote, if you metaphorically died and went to heaven, you could ask the oracle whatever you wanted. What would you like to know? So I mean, it's all the same question. So maybe we can start over and go this way. Just to summarize it more prosaically, like, what would you love to see in terms of understanding how LLMs work?
I don't know what this would actually practically look like, and I don't know if it's like practically actually something that could exist, but I think having a causal model that tells me here's a string of words and this is the sort of process that like composed them into some kind of meaning, and then this is like the action that was taken in response, I think could be useful. So I don't know. I come from like this. Is
the LLM itself not that already?
No,
or do you
I mean
want
it's
a simpler version of the.
Well, it's doing something, but I guess we don't like. I guess one thing that I've had in my head is like, can you like distill like a decision tree from a language model? And that's the kind of thing that like, can you distill a decision tree, and then the like nodes are understandable in terms of like. How it's like quote unquote making decisions about what it's doing.
Right.
But I don't know.
I would love that too.
Yeah.
I think it's a good answer. Yeah.
I guess I'll give like the answer as a linguist would be to kind of see like what is the linguistic theory actually encoded in the language model, without having to rely so much on this kind of top-down thing of saying, okay, we have an idea about what's a grammatical subject, what's a grammatical object, and then we can go look for that in the model. Like if we could somehow in a more unsupervised way get something which isn't just kind of a mess, but is like a kind of structured linguistic theory that emerges from the model without us kind of imposing something on top of it.
And do you think there are any existing linguistic theories that are up to the task, or would we have to develop?
I mean, I think there's plenty of, like, I mean, that's like one of the kind of common research directions now is to take ideas from linguistic theory, like, you know, grammatical subject or something about a hierarchical relationship, and then find it in the model. And like people have even been successful finding neural circuits that seem to be computing something that we think is linguistically interesting. But that then comes, I think it would be really interesting to not have to come up with those things ahead of time, but to kind of have it emerge from the model and then develop a theory around that, and then
I really do love some of the papers where they focus on a particular linguistic phenomenon and show that the model shares that feature, and then they can figure out how the model implements it. I'd love to see more of that.
I think my answer is on a similar flavor, maybe from the other direction, that I am excited to see advances in interpretable AI methods, that we have ways of being able to pull out structure that's interpretable, and maybe it gets assigned a linguistic label, or maybe it gets assigned something else, so that we can then be able to actually use them in an interpretable way to understand if the brain does something similar, but even just for better understanding how these models operate in a kind of like data-driven, unsupervised way, be able to pull out structures that we're able to kind of assign meaning to.
I'm following a little bit the literature on like people in diffusion models for video, kind of hoping these will become world models. And I don't know if anyone here works on that, but I think there's this like idea that if you have a really good diffusion model, you can learn robotics on top of that. And man, I am a skeptic. Like, it's been infuriating how hard it has been to get anything out of language models. And I mean, like, I know people have written papers on that stuff, but like, I don't know. Even when I read some of those papers, it could be 50 other circuits. There's no notion of it like really being isolated, and like there's so much redundancy. And I guess I'm just kind of like, this might just be a mess of spaghetti, and we shouldn't trust that there's theory inside of it in the same way that I'm not sure I would trust humans really understand grammar in any kind of deep way. And I would love, love, love to pull all this stuff out, but I guess I'm like a skeptic at the moment.
Nihilist, yeah.
I mean, there are arguments, like you probably know this better than me, but aren't there like PDE equations that they came up with in the 1800s, and they thought they'd figure them out, and like we've made no progress at all. Like this kind of optimism that science, if we just think hard, will like find the answer is not always true.
It depends on the PDE. my take on things is if a dynamical system is extremely robust, like its future dynamics doesn't depend on detail on its current state, then you should be able to find a simpler model of the dynamics that mimics it in some aspects.
Interesting.
And so I think that human reasoning and behavior is relatively robust. Like, it doesn't depend on all the neurons. And so that's why we can actually record a small number of neurons in the brain and actually decode important variables and so forth. It actually remains to be seen, though, whether LLMs are as robust as human cognitive dynamics, right? They might not be. And if they're not robust, then we have no hope of understanding them in some sense, almost tautologically, because robustness means it doesn't depend on the details, right? It's like understanding a chaotic system. You're never going to be able to understand it, except in maybe some core statistical way, right? So I think it's an open question. Yeah.
Honestly, that made me a little more optimistic, just hearing that. At least there was a sense of what it would need to have, right?
I think it's easier to understand highly performant systems that are robust than it is to understand Rube Goldberg devices that are at the edge of performance. Right? And so maybe as LLMs get better and better, they'll be easier to understand, hopefully.
Or there'll be some change towards a more robust system.
Exactly, yeah. And there's also an aspect of looking underneath where the lamppost is. Like, even when physicists try to understand nature, they don't try to understand everything. They have a sense of what's understandable and what's not. And usually the things that we find interesting are the things that are understandable. And I don't think that's just a tautology. And so there'll be some phenomena in LLMs that are understandable and some that are not. And the art of doing science is extracting those phenomena that are understandable and kind of going after them like a guided missile, right? And ignoring the rest that's not understandable.
Cool.
Yeah.
I will say one other thing that's been neat from an academic point of view is a kind of field of people who were kind of trained as engineers, kind of trying to learn how to be scientists.
Yeah.
And like the research style has changed a lot with that in mind, both in scaling and interpretability of like running experiments on computer systems. It's like not really a thing. Yeah.
It warms my heart to see CS engineers talking about physics papers like Moore is different from Anderson, or biology papers about evolution. And it's really interesting. I mean, for the first time, forward engineering has not led to a performance system or the frontier system of performance. Anyways, maybe let's go on to Brenden.
Right. So if I had an oracle to learn something about what LLMs are doing, I like the way you put it in your talk, Surya, about this sort of curve of understanding where you could there'd be sort of a array of models progressively simpler and with some decrease in performance, and you can traverse that curve. So, I mean, if for a particular query to have a sort of symbolic understanding of what the LLM is doing as like some pseudocode that you could read, and that approximates the operations that it just performed, and not necessarily exactly, but you could read that and then figure out, how much of the actual structure of the forward pass is that captured. And I think that would be very useful, and people are trying to do things like that. Maybe in the spirit of being controversial, to push back a little bit on the notion that we absolutely must understand these systems and how they work in detail, because we're scientists and that's what we do, and we're not satisfied until we've gotten to that point. I mean, I'm definitely sympathetic to that, and I think there's a truth to that. On the other hand, if I think about what are like the ultimate goals of cognitive science and behavioral sciences, if we really have major advances in terms of modeling and have models that can reproduce human behavior and learning, right? What would we be able to do if that field matures to a very much more so than it is today? And I think even if we have black box models that can produce detailed behavioral predictions about learning and development, I think that would satisfy me about like 50% of the goals of what I would want from the outcome of that field, right? The types of things we write in our grant applications for broader impacts, right? If you could simulate how people learn, how children learn and develop, just if you had a simulator that you couldn't understand, but you could try a million different educational curricula, right, in simulation and see which ones work the best. You could simulate developmental delays and what the right therapies would be without understanding of the mechanism necessarily. You could, there's many things we could do even if we didn't understand how that black box works, if its behavioral predictions were extremely accurate.
That's right, yeah, absolutely. It's like in drugs, we don't understand the mechanism of most drugs, but we do trials and we make sure they work and they're safe, and that's good enough.
You do a really good job of targeting advertising. It's a joke. Okay. If I was going to ask an oracle, I think I would want to know what the amount of information is that you have to build in, say, Kolmogorov complexity or something, in order to learn on human-sized data. And that to me seems like a very deep question about human nature and kind of what's different between humans and other species. And as far as I can tell, like virtually completely open, right? So it could be very, very tiny, or it could be a gigantic amount, right? And requiring a lot of training data, if models do require it, is sort of the same as building in a lot of sort of innate data, right? So, I would ask that.
Wouldn't it be depressing if you were like 5 megabytes? Like that's all I want. 5 megabytes. I don't know if I want to know that.
It's funny. I had a grad student, Frank Malika, write a paper trying to estimate the amount of information you learn in language, and the answer was like 4 megabytes. 4.9 maybe. It was up there somewhere. But
our DNA for reference is about 700 megabytes, and so if you convert that to English words through entropy, it's about 600 million words. We're exposed to 100 million words, and language models are trained on 1 trillion words. So I'm actually curious, what is your interpretation? We're talking about like the contribution of the entire legacy of evolution to our ability to learn. it's at least communicated through a bottleneck of 600 million words, right? Our DNA. What's your interpretation of that? Like just react. I don't know. What would you?
So we think there are like roughly 10 trillion words is the limit right now of like usable English words to train a language model on.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's what?
It's way more. It's way more than what evolution gives us. Yeah. And keep in mind, we have to build livers, kidneys, all that stuff. So not all of that is for the brain. And so, yeah, I think it's, I think we're incredibly efficient. And evolution can communicate everything through such a small amount of information. It's remarkable. We have zero principles for how that works. Let me just, one last question, mostly a triggering question. So there's this famous and irritating quote, probably to some of you, from the IBM speech manager, right? That every time I fire a linguist, my performance of my speech recognition system goes up. Now that LLMs have taken over, and I think part of the goal of computational linguistics was also to understand how humans process language, but also to build language systems that work well, right? And computer scientists kind of beat the linguist to it. So what's your reaction to that? What is the role for the future of linguistics? Does it retreat to just being a subject about how human language works? What's your take? Maybe for the linguists in the
I don't know.
I mean, honestly, I feel like computer scientists have the bigger issue right now. Like, there were so many interesting questions posed today from the linguists, and like, I don't know if they're the same interesting questions from from NLP at the moment. Like, because it's so targeted towards applications, it's in a much kind of harder spot right now. What do we work on in this regard? I don't know if you guys feel that way. Like, you're running out of problems.
Yeah, I've taken linguistics to always be about the kind of human language question, and I think this is, like as people have been saying over and over, this is like such an exciting time because it feels like we're really getting answers that we couldn't get before because of all these tools. Do you think that like that quote can be like a bit disingenuous on both sides? Like on the linguistics side, there can now be a tendency to say, oh, like we never thought linguistics would be useful for building systems. Like I don't think that was true. I think there was always a thought that if we can write down the correct generative grammar for a language and do that across many languages, and we can then like parse, and have some deep structure and some generative process, and like that will be the key to all this. Right. And I think in some meaningful way that's turned out not to be the key to all this. But like I mentioned in my talk, there is like this tradition of like functional and statistical linguistics, which I think like really is a predecessor of a lot of neural networks. So I think the fact that like early neural models, like in the 80s were, like Rumelhart and McClellan's model of like the English past tense, were kind of really like linguistic models looking at linguistic human kind of questions and designed to be biologically plausible. And the problem was like they didn't really work very well. Right. But like as those have been scaled up now, they work well. And we kind of think, there's a criticism they're not biologically plausible, but I think like those core ideas of like what a biologically plausible neuron is still somewhere in the core of the technologies today.
Any other linguists want to react, or we can open? Oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure I would call myself a linguist, but I've hung out with a lot of them. I think that the field of linguistics is like changed, but I think that it's still very, it's like an exciting time, and there are a bunch of questions now that are open to be tested. And if the goal of linguistics is to understand language as its own kind of existing phenomenon, then now we have these systems that we can run all of these experiments on and really understand how understand language structure from a different angle. And relating to that annoying quote, I think that that's not just true of like, if you impose, people thought that if you could just impose linguistic structure into these models, then you won't need as much data to train the model because you're kind of giving it a leg up by starting it off with the right primitives. And it turns out that those primitives actually were not quite right, I guess, or like it was better actually to spend data to learn them. And I think that that's not a linguistics problem specifically. I think that there are a number of things that we thought that would be important primitives that actually ended up being it's better just to allow the model to learn for itself.
For what it's worth, I think physical chemists have a similar relationship with AlphaFold. Anyways, but sorry.
I would just add that it came to me that so Jeff Ellman, who was like one of the kind of connectionists and invented the Ellman net, which is really like kind of the first like early RNN. He was a UT Austin linguistics PhD student, which is my department now. And so like I don't know, I think in the 90s like he would have been a good hire for IBM. If,
what was awesome back then is that there was much more shared overlap of expertise within the same person. It was really amazing time. Let's open it up to the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, since we're all talking about language models, and most of these language models are based 90% or so on English specifically, what do you think the impact is of everyone now studying language models and specifically English language models on the conclusions and like everything we're learning from that? How robust is everything we're doing and learning now? Sorry, apparently that was a difficult question.
I mean, yeah, I think the answer is we need work in a lot more languages, and that's something I think linguistics can do by building data sets, by finding languages which are interestingly, like, I think it would be really surprising if it turns out that the current set of models, and, even maybe the transformer architecture itself, are kind of skewed to do better on English, and languages with very different structures will be quite different, and I think we might learn interesting things. I think like some of the conclusions about kind of what's possible from statistical learning, I think it would be also really surprising if it turned out that English was amenable to like being learned statistically and other languages turned out to like not be in some fundamental way would be really strange. But like the kind of thing that should be, and there is like more and more work on a wider variety of languages, but there should be even more of it. And yeah, it's happening, but probably not as fast as it should.
Yeah.
One thing.
We had actually a really nice panel we ran a conference last year called Colum, like a conference on language model, with 4 people who have trained language models specifically in different languages. I won't speak for them, but it's online. You can watch it if you're interested. One thing that came up that was quite interesting is just when you talk about scaling, there's this question of data available in different languages. And so you get this fear of like if you have a language, say in Finnish, but then you also include English data, there's going to be so much more English data, it might dominate, therefore it might solve problems based on the English solutions versus the Finnish solutions. And so you get this question both of the kind of language structure, but also of kind of political goals or sovereignty or like what you might want if you're training a model. It's all super fascinating and relevant.
If I remember correctly, like training on some other languages help you on a third language, on an N+1 language, right?
Yes, with the caveat that like things like it might go through English to answer questions or something, right? And it's not totally clear if that's what you want or not. It'll do better on the metrics, but it might provide a cultural bias that may or may not be true.
Yeah, so would you agree with the statement which said the main thing LLMs fold into the picture that's new is lexical semantics? And if you do agree with it, what else would you say it brings to the table? What are the next most important things, if that is the next?
If you could repeat the question for the.
Yeah, well, maybe you can say a bit more in terms of like what does it bring theoretically, or what does it bring?
No, practically. What is it that leads to this? If you were trying to understand why are they so successful. Why did they succeed where so many years of NLP did not?
It's certainly bigger than lexical semantics, I'll say that. Like, yeah. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question.
I put together lexical semantics with long-distance dependencies, right? And a lot of the formalisms that people worked with in kind of, early 2000s era computational linguistics, we do things like assume context-free grammars where do things like assume context-free grammars where, one part of a derivation, by assumption doesn't affect another part. And then people would hack together things that would try to break that a little bit. So try to have the verb you use over here affect the nouns you use in the subject or something like that. And I think in retrospect, all of that was just kind of hacked together. Maybe people knew it at the time. And what modern language models seem to do a very good job of is tracking the long-distance dependencies and then combining them with lexical semantics. That would be my guess.
But I guess I'll just from personal experience. So I did my dissertation in 2014. It was on exactly that. It was like context-free grammars for translation. It's like translating from one language to another, and it made the assumption that there were like kind of constituent phrases in one language that could be pulled over and translated roughly independently of the things around them. And then in 2014, the kind of first predecessors to large language models came out and just did away with all of that. Totally global, connected model. Immediately better in lexical semantics, but also better in syntactic structure, better in semantics, better in kind of global knowledge. That stuff all happened, though, 10 years ago now, right? So everything that's happened since then is gone way beyond even those sort of initial phenomena.
I do think there's something to the lexical semantics point, especially around, so there's an idea of constructions and construction grammar, which Adele Goldberg and others have been associated with. And I think it is the case that language models have made so much progress kind of like on memorizing these specific instances. So things like, green paint is kind of fully compositional. If you know what green and paint means, you kind of know what green paint means. And like the band Green Day is not compositional at all. Like, right, you just have to know Green Day is a band, but like green tea is kind of in the middle, right? And so like it's kind of green, but if you just know green, you just know tea, you don't really know what green tea is. And like models are really good at knowing like this, right? Like this kind of fuzzy notion of compositionality or like constructions, like the more the merrier, or like the better the teacher, the happier the students. Like these kinds of things, which are hard and not really the kinds of things that like, right? There are things that if you were writing down a grammar of a language, it would take you a really long time to get to those kinds of things. And then you'd run into issues with like, okay, how many definitions of the word like green do I need if I have some system which is like taking lexical input? And like, I think that's one thing that models have convinced me of, is that getting those kinds of things right is actually like much more important than I think a lot of people like in linguistics thought.
Hi, I have a question regarding the concept of human-like, and I want to ask a question about from a normative standard, do you think that large language models should be expected as human-like, and in what dimension should they be human-like? My background of asking this question is it seems that a lot of the descriptive and comparative work focuses on large language model being human-like. But it's very easy to see that sometimes large language models are very superhuman-like in generating text and writing creatively, and I cannot really do that. But sometimes humans are like emotionally very intelligent, but maybe like language models still have a long way to go. So another way to ask this question is like, are there some properties and human capabilities that you think large language models should better have? And are there like some cognitive abilities you think we don't really care? It's okay if language models don't have that.
I think this is maybe, well, I don't know. I guess maybe the sort of, I don't remember who made the point about like defining understanding. I think one aspect that we take for granted in other people is that they tend to be relatively predictable. So we can form coherent models of people we might encounter, even under like including like uncertainty and so on. And so that's I think a property that we want models to have, so that we can more easily like interact with them in predictable ways. What was my other point? I had something and then I just like, yeah. Okay, never mind. Maybe I'll hold this just so I...
Alane, I was thinking about in your talk how you were talking about things like sycophancy. That's like a human-like behavior that's maybe not a positive behavior.
Yeah.
That kind of gets added? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I find it hard to place like absolute judgments on behaviors out of context.
Oh, I see. That's so smart and clever of you.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, in some sense, I just saw a talk from the post-training team at OpenAI, and the post-training team is working their butts off to make the language models palatable to humans, figuring out the right places to put their refusal boundaries when they refuse to answer a question, figuring out the right notion of agreeableness, the right notion of expressivity, that like, and a lot of it seeps in from human preferences and so forth. So I think what you're asking is like the name of the game and the commercial viability of these models is how do you get them to be more useful and pleasing to humans. But I think human preferences come in a lot into
To add a little bit more to that, yeah, I don't think our AI models have to be human-like, right? This is where the fields diverge. AI, is at its heart an engineering discipline. Just want to build systems that can do interesting tasks, and then the rest of what this workshop is about in the cognitive science and the neuroscience, we want to understand human intelligence and animal intelligence, natural intelligence. It's a really useful yardstick, though, so that's why the comparison between LLMs and people, I mean, we've seen it many times throughout the presentations today and yesterday. Because humans are the most intelligent being that we know of. I mean, if I had to add a few things that I think are qualities of human language and cognition that LLMs are really missing today. Again, this systematicity and reliability and robustness to differences in input, I think is still a really big difference, and it could have real implications. Like when you, especially if you teach somebody something that is like a safety critical fact. Like I learned recently that dogs shouldn't eat grapes. I didn't know that, right? But as soon as I learned that, or you tell somebody else something that's important, you kind of have this implicit trust, this robustness that you're going to be able to retrieve that fact, and you won't be sort of fooled by a slight difference in wording, right? But you can do this to LLMs. They know those facts because they've read them a lot on the internet, so they're useful in that way. But you could say, I'm making a yummy snack for my dog because he hasn't been eating well recently. I put in his favorite doggy chow and some chopped grapes and a can of fish. What else would he like? And it'll know the fact, but it'll just provide you suggestions. So it's not human-like in that way.
I've been through that experience firsthand when I learned I shouldn't give my dog grapes, and it sets up a fear. I mean, your amygdala lights up thinking, oh my God, if I give my dog grapes, it could get hurt, and that fear unlocks memory storage, and so we have this whole connection between emotion and memory and retrieval. So LLMs don't have direct fear, right?
I recently learned that that avocados are poisonous to birds.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't have a bird, so I can forget that one. Any other questions? Maybe I've been facing. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in knowing how working with LLMs have changed your beliefs about human cognition.
Great question.
Okay. I have the mic, so I'll start. There's a lot of things surprising about LLMs to me personally, I think to many others. But one that stood out in particular is sort of the ability of one system to do many different tasks. So that seemed truly special and unique to people just a few years ago, right? And if you wanted a system to do high-performance object recognition, you had that system. You wanted a system to do detection and segmentation, that would be a different model, right? And same with NLP. You wanted a system to do parsing. You wanted a system to generate a sentence. Or there were often sentiment analysis, different systems for different tasks, right? And the fact that I guess somewhere between GPT-2 and GPT-3, this surprise that there could be meta learning in some sense and be able to handle new tasks without having to, that just comes from massive training, that was surprising.
And that's why they're so appropriately called foundation models. Sorry, it's a Stanford joke. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
I guess I have a small one. I think as a researcher, I think I was I was a big believer in benchmarks. Like, I thought that was like a really critical thing for empirical fields. And we're in this really weird stage right now where no one knows how to evaluate models. And that is very strange, because I know they can't do everything, and I know they can't do nothing, but I don't know where in between those things we are. And so I think it's probably fair to say there is like literally no static benchmark in the world right now that they're not superhuman on, which is crazy.
What's your take on things like Dynabench and the chatbot arena, like dynamic benchmarking and dynamic adversarial benchmarking and vibe checking through an arena? Like,
I don't know. So, what do you think? Can I call a friend?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Dynabench, I think, is probably saturated, and chatbot arena, people have shown that it can be very subjective, and so every benchmark has its own issues. Yeah.
It's a fair way to say that bullet points are really important. That means you're really smart if you have bullet points.
I see.
Yeah, when established.
Got it.
No, is that not right? That wasn't no. What matters? Length?
I have no idea. But
Not I think bullet points do matter.
I think we're at a point now where, like, if a student in an email gives me a bunch of bullet points, I'm 100% certain that it was ChatGPT.
Maybe a couple more questions because it's getting late. Yeah, I've been kind of have my back here, so go ahead.
Do you think that having multilingual models means that they are also going to be more interpretable? Having like models that sort of understand different language structure and grammar, etc., means that they are also more interpretable to us human beings?
Sorry. So you mean like training like models on
multiple languages? Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know about interpretable. I think, like a few years ago, kind of in the BERT era, then there was multilingual BERT, and at the same time, like a few models that were just training on, like 100 languages at once. And then there was some really interesting probing work looking at what kinds of representations were language general or language specific. And I feel like some of that, for some reason, there's like less of that recently, even though there've been like Meta just has an open source multilingual, like they're still out there. But yeah, I think that was a really interesting line of work of saying, like, if you train on a bunch of languages at once, what's shared and what's not? And the answers were really, like there's a paper by Ethan Chi and John Hewitt and Chris Manning where they showed, like, if you train on all these languages and then learn some, like basically have some probes in different languages, you recover similar kinds of syntactic dependencies across languages. Like yeah, interesting stuff.
Cool. Maybe the last or. Okay, 2 more questions, then we'll definitely stop. Go ahead.
Do you think LLMs are better framed as like models of language, or like universal computation engines that happen to train a lot of sequences that include like natural language, but also a bunch of other sequences like stock prices, all kinds of things? For example, there's this interesting paper where, like, called pre-trained transformers as universal computation engines, where they basically freeze the whole LLM and only find you like minimal parts, and it can work on all kinds of sequences, like, or like get decent performance on biological sequences and whatever.
So I think those papers, and there's a couple of results like this that are really neat. One I just read was from Nate Grover at NYU about using a language model to do kind of a molecule, like crystal structure prediction, and they showed it was way better. But I think the causality is maybe reversed. Like, I think training these things on language, we know that works, and we know that generalizes, but we don't know the opposite. Like, it's not clear at all that if you train a model on stock time series, it's going to like learn grammar, right? So I think kind of maybe what we're seeing is that, like, in the process of this very large scale training on very hard problems, some kind of maybe computational primitives are being learned, like copying or kind of matching of that form. But I don't think we've seen a really convincing result that you can just remove the language from that process entirely. At least empirically, I haven't seen that yet.
My favorite example is ESM-Fold, where it was trained on protein sequences, amino acid sequences, and from their interrepetitions, you could deduce protein structure. So structure from sequence is very beautiful. Okay, last question.
So all over Twitter, I'm reading that 2025 is the year of agents. just wondering, like, is like this reasoning thing the last frontier in LLMs? Like, what's next, both as a student and as like as general public?
Great question.
I mean, I don't know how to scale this up in ways that like companies would be interested in accumulating resources for, but I think that interaction, like multi-agent interaction, and I think very explicitly like human agent interaction is probably, I mean, I don't know, that's like, maybe I'm biased, but I feel like that's like something that is underexplored and like relevant, like very relevant. But again, I'm very biased because that's like what I talked about in my talk.
It feels like they could crowdsource the collection of the type of data you're looking at.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I think my perspective is that like language is constantly producing new things, and like we can handle that. Like we can do the sort of causal reasoning that allows us to do that. But like, I don't think we can learn. I don't see evidence that the models themselves are like robustly able to do that. Like to learn, basically.
I see.
Anyway.
Any other thoughts on like the next big thing question?
I'm not going to try to speculate what the next big thing in LLMs are, but in the spirit of this workshop, I guess what I'm most excited about. Well, when you go to NeurIPS, right, and you see that there's 10,000 posters and 60% of them have some LLM in it, or they're working on tweaks for LLMs, you just realize that community, there's a tremendous community, tremendous amount of resources pouring into trying to make LLMs better in various ways, and I think that's happening no matter what. But there is real potential, and it's not clear it's happening at the same rate or in the same way, for using these new tools that we've never had before, and these new computational firepower and algorithms that learn better than anything we've had before, to try to understand how people learn, how children develop, how cognition works, how the brain works. That is the community that I really hope grows and takes advantage of these new tools that we have, and that's why I'm so excited to be here at this workshop, and glad that there aren't 5,000 more tweaks of how to train your LLM slightly better.
Yeah, great answer. All right, it's getting late, so let's thank the panel. Thanks so much. Yeah, we'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks.
Yeah, your name looks good. Yeah. I feel like that's